A friend of mine once said to me that he preferred Japanese anime and manga much more than American TV series, because the Japanese series were much less cliched than their American equivalents. I said to him that the Japanese series were just as cliched. The difference was that they were different cliches, so we didn't recognize them as we hadn't been exposed to them as much. I then went on to prove my point by exactly predicting the end of a 26-episode anime series after having seen only the first episode. Two papers I've chosen today are Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy by Arjun Appadurai, and secondly, Popular Representations of the Past, The Case of Post-War Japan by Naoko Shimazu. I've chosen these papers because I'm interested in the way trends reflect the representation of Japan in anime and manga. But firstly, in how the global cultural economy has shaped which particular anime and manga series I get exposed to here in Australia. And secondly, how the history of Japan has shaped those cliches in the first place. For the first paper, Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy. Obviously, changes in global cultural economy have changed what series get released here in Australia. In the 80s, it was primarily children's cartoon series like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Transformers. In the 90s, it became primarily cyberpunk psychological anime like Neon Genesis Evangelion and Ghost in the Shell, similar series. So how does the global cultural economy shape what gets released? Unfortunately, going into reading this paper with these ideas in mind, I was sorely disappointed. He opens with an introduction about the tension between global cultural homogenization and cultural heterogenization. And then goes on to say that the majority of academic studies talk about homogenization only. To me, this leaves this opening sentence with a bit of an unmentioned but hanging over it, as in, but what about the heterogenization? It was a vaguely promising start, hoping he would talk about cultural properties that get released overseas. Unfortunately, after this introduction, he then completely forgets about it and goes on to talk about, as he terms it, a new framework to talk about global cultural flows. He then defines 5 new terms. It calls them the 5 scapes: ethnoscape, mediascape, technoscape, financescape, and idioscapes. His paper is this section of the paper is entirely devoted to defining a new system of terms that he himself has invented. This attempts to popularize them in order to define cultural flows. He summarizes this section as global cultural flows occur in and through the growing disjuncture between ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, mediascapes, and idioscapes. He spends a full quarter of the paper defining these terms. At the end of this section, he basically just forgets about them. He mentions the term once or twice from then on, but otherwise he bounces from ideas to ideas, from example to example, never coming to any particular point or bottom line. So he talks about deterritorialization, goes from there to new markets for film companies as a result of this, somehow getting from there to the idea of nation states, and then the spread of martial arts, and the idea of production fetishism. In no way does he attempt to present a coherent argument, nor does he attempt to push his new framework that he's spent the first quarter of the paper defining. I'm trying not to be overcritical, but it seems to me that he's just writing this paper because he enjoys the sound of his own keyboard typing. At the end of the paper, I've come out with no better ideas about global cultural economy that I went in, and it simply says to me that he just likes using big words. It's rare that he has a line that doesn't have a word that's more than 15 letters long. Sadly, I did not get out of this paper what I was hoping to get out. So I moved on to the second paper. Naoko Shimazu, Popular Representations of the Past, The Case of Post-War Japan. I read in other academic papers by writers such as Susan Napier that a lot of Japanese popular culture is shaped by the the idea of Japan as victims that came out of the Second World War. So a lot of popular culture, like the Godzilla movies and a movie called Japan Sinks, the villain is it's just science. It's not a person. It's not something they can do. It's just something that's happening to them. So the question is, how many of Japan's basically cliches in anime have resulted from the post-war idea? So Naoko Shimazu talks about the history of basically what Japan's popular culture thinks of the war, the Second World War, and their loss in the Second World War as time goes on. So about the first half of her paper, she spends talking basically the history of Japan's culture, the culture of Japan, how they regard the war. So in the 1930s, in pre-war, there was a huge trend of reorientation to the nationalist cause, police pressure forcing essentially 95% of Japan's authors and writers and literature professors to basically conform to the nationalist ideals of expansionism, imperialism. She then goes through the post-war impressions of the war. Basically, in the 1940s, it was an idea of catharsis. It was people trying to get out their guilt over what had happened during the Second World War. In the 1950s, it became taboo to talk about the war. This is the establishment of the Japanese as the victims of the war. They had essentially they were the victims of the imperialist culture that had come before. They'd lost the war entirely as a fault of the culture that had come before. In the 1960s, the general idea became commemorative. Let's remember what happened during the war. In the 1970s, it became this idea of daytime TV. So shows about the war happened during the day. They were watched by retired people and housewives, essentially. In the 1980s, the general idea changed to apathy. The war was, by this point, 40 years ago. The youth of the day didn't really care about it. In the 1990s, this change in political climate is the idea that they needed to come to terms with what had happened during the war. A new climate of let's understand what happened, what led to that point. And he also touches briefly in 2 sections on women's literature and its response to the war, and it's basically responses to the atomic bomb. I found it a fairly interesting read. It was quite a concise study of the history of Japan's the popular culture's response to the war. I felt that she, on several occasions, touched on some points that it seemed like that she wanted to talk in more detail about these points, but was forced to confine herself to the particular paper that she decided to write. She finishes by a section on modern culture, so popularization leads to a lack of moral criteria, to use her words. She used a particular example of Kobayashi Yoshinori, who is an extremely popular modern writer who portrays Japan as the heroes in the World War and the other countries as villains. She describes as having an overwhelming influence on Japanese youth simply because because this particular author sells a lot of books. I think this is not a very good argument to make. One could say that, for example, Stephanie Meyer controls American youth because her Twilight series has sold so well. It's not really a strong argument. However, I do believe that overall that Shimazu Naoko has made a strong case as to how the representations of the Second War have changed over the history of over Japan's history. In conclusion, it's clear that the global cultural economy and representation of the past are both very, very complex subjects. However, it's also fairly clear to me that some writers are much better at expressing the past than others. I don't think I learned a great deal about what I intended to learn going in, but I certainly learned a lot about the representation of Second World War in Japanese post-war literature, though not a great deal about the global cultural economy. Thank you for listening.